Hey guys, how's it going? Lee here. Now we all know the Australian dream is to complete school, find work somehow, whether you go through university to find work or you find some kind of work straight after high school, and then buy your first own home. And as a result, there's a very common sentiment in Australia that renting is inferior and that rent money is dead money. Because instead of paying off your own mortgage, you're helping pay somebody else's. Now this is something that I battled with first of all moving out of home, and I went through a lot of the pros and cons in renting versus buying, and hopefully today I'm going to go over that and help some of you guys in making that decision. First of all, let's look at buying. Now for many people who have a steady career path and know where they're going to be going into and advancing in seniority or getting promotions and whatnot, if you're in a steady place like CBD, Sydney, Brisbane or Melbourne, then you generally know that you won't be moving outside of that. Particularly if you want to have a family in the future, it makes sense just to buy a place and to stay put. And that gives you stability because you are going to buy a home that you own. And number two, it gives you choice because you get to choose the type of home that you buy, whether you want 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom, 4 bedroom, 3 bathroom, 8 bathroom, and 18 bedrooms, who knows. Now, when we're talking about choice, you obviously have the choice to rent wherever you want also, and it's actually a bit more dynamic because you can move from place to place. In saying that, you can't underestimate how important security is to an individual, especially if they want to start up a family. Because not being dictated, controlled at the whim of the landlord is so important. And knowing that where you sleep at night will be where you're sleeping tomorrow without an eviction notice or some kind of notice that would intrude on your privacy or force you to move from one place to another. And this could be really troubling, especially if you have a family. Another part of security is obviously having a roof over your head, right? That's one of the necessities in life, is to have a shelter that we can stay within. Now, I remember when we first moved over to Australia, and at that time we had very little to almost no money, right? But we had a roof over our head and food on our table always. And as a kid, I never thought that I was poor. It's not until now where I'm in a better financial space that I actually look back on how we lived when I was 6 years old moving over to Australia that I realized how poor we were. That kind of shows you the importance of just having a few necessities in life and what that could mean for an individual. So being able to secure shelter or a roof over your head really means a lot psychologically and physically. One of the other benefits or beauty of buying your own home is obviously having ownership over it, right? You can make renovations to kitchens, to bathrooms, you can change whatever you want, tear down a wall, put up another wall, split up a bedroom, put an ensuite in your bedroom. You can really do whatever you want, and the world is your oyster. The world being the home that you buy. And I guess the only thing that you really have to adhere to in owning a home is paying off the loan. But if you're renting, you're paying off the landlord anyway. So either way, it works out the same. But one of the other benefits of owning your own home is being able to make the repayments off a lot faster. And the other point is changing the home loan rate and switching banks and switching mortgage rates if they're depending on the market, I guess. But that really depends on a lot of players in the market in general. Now, the second benefit of buying your own home is locking in a price. And now I see a home as a forced savings plan. If you're really horrible at savings, making money or budgeting, and you have no intention to invest in the future, now this locking in a price kind of goes back to our first point and really depends if you want to stay in the area that you're going to buy in for 8, 10, 20, 30 years. And this is particularly so if you want to live in one of the capital cities of Australia, because generally they go up in price. So if you can lock the price at the current moment, and obviously prices can go down too, which we've seen in Sydney. So, this is all dependent on a varying array of factors. But generally, if you can lock in a price at the current market rate, in the future, it generally goes up. So if you decided to live in this capital city that you're working in the future, generally you're going to have to pay a higher price because prices should have moved up by then. And now a study was conducted which constructed 144 future scenarios which showed the benefits of buying versus renting. And in all those scenarios, on average, it was always better for somebody to actually pay off their home and sell it off within 10 years as opposed to putting it into a mixture of investments. Now, before you get mad at the study, which I'll be honest, I was kind of triggered. Obviously, there's a lot of assumptions that they make. They make the assumption that the prices are going to go up within 10 years in the housing market, kind of like what Sydney and Melbourne have, that big boom. And they haven't included a lot of costs that you could incur in ownership. Maybe if the property there's damage to the property, the market goes down, all that kind of stuff. But I understand where the study is coming from, and generally, prices in the capital city do go up, especially within a 10-year period. Now, it's unfortunate if you're in that cycle where it's going downwards, but for the most part, they do go up. And one of the other things that I did mention before, buying your own home becomes a forced savings plan. Now, if you have no intention to invest, to save, you're horrible at budgeting, all of that, I would just dump all your money into your home loan and then put it there. Obviously, have 6 months worth of expenses on the side, as anybody would suggest. But I would put all your money in there because at least you're saving 3% on interest on a loan of, let's say, $300,000, which is a fair amount. And if in the future you figured out how to invest, you want to invest, you realize that you actually need money to retire, then you could always draw down a line of credit from that home. You could sell it for cash so you can invest, which is, because then you have to use the cash to buy another home. Maybe if you're willing to downsize, there's a few other factors that you have to look into. Obviously, none of this is personal advice, we all know that. But at least you have equity within the home, so there's a lot of things that you can still do with it, as opposed to having nothing at all. Now, what are some of the cons of buying? Well, one, you're locked into the one property, you're going to stay in the one place. And number two, you're going to have liability for the property. So if anything happens, there's no landlord to run to, there's an insurer to run through, and your bank to answer to. Now, when you purchase your first home, most people are going to go through banks, unless you're like a millionaire. And even if you were a millionaire, that's probably the worst allocation of your capital, to put it all into your home. But if, like many of us, you're not a millionaire and you don't want to allocate capital in that manner, then obviously you're going to have to get a loan, and you're going to be liable for that loan and paying that off. So this means that you can't just freely move overseas and not have to pay for it or sell it or rent it out, which then incurs its own fees with managing agents because you're overseas, and then any repairs that come along with it. So there's a lot of costs that come with owning property and having it under your name. Now, I've worked with a lot of first home owners, and I always find it funny and intriguing. And I mean, it's no fault to the first home owner. Obviously, they haven't owned any properties before, but they tend to neglect the little costs that you might incur in owning property, like insurance, paying rates, paying water, all these other kind of costs on the side associated with actually owning the property. And generally, most of the times, they just measure what the mortgage repayments are actually going to be on a monthly basis. Now, that's what it's like being liable, right? But being locked in means that, again, you can't really move freely. You can't use the capital that you would have saved otherwise in renting to put into other fruitful investments like shares, not bonds, cryptocurrency.
What am I gonna do?
Or the good old real estate investments that Australians love to talk about. Own, have, loan out, finance their whole life, give up their whole soul, well-being, time, everything up for. But essentially, your capital will be tied down to the mortgage unless you're saving on the side and already investing and doing all of that great, wonderful, magical stuff. So really, paying off your own home and owning it is perfect for somebody who's looking to stay put in one area and knows where they're going with their career path, has no intention of moving overseas and whatnot, and also has no interest or really care too much about investing and is just enjoying their life, which is fine. I mean, you can have a happy, fulfilling life in your early 20s, 30s, and then, I mean, it's not ideal, but you can worry about all that kind of stuff later on. So we've heard about buying and what the pros and cons are about buying. Essentially, the pros of renting is going to be the cons of buying. They generally tend to marry up, right? So the first pro of renting is obviously freeing up your savings and deploying it elsewhere in investing opportunities. And so you can either speculatively invest for growth, whether that's in shares, in property, or you can invest for cash flow, whether that's in shares or property or cryptocurrency. Speculation. Teens. And one of the reasons why a lot of people choose to rent is that they can rent in a cheaper place than they can own. The worst situation you can get yourself in is if your rent would have been the same as your home loan that you would have paid off. Like, that's probably one of the worst. No, actually, even worse is if your rent is even higher than what you would have paid for the ideal home loan you want because you couldn't save up for a deposit. That's bad. You should really move out and then go to a cheaper place to rent. But again, this idea of freeing up your capital for fruitful investment opportunities really base itself on the fact that you will use the capital to invest at some point. Because if you just hold on to cash for the sake of holding on to cash, even if you put it in the highest interest savings account, which I'll make a video on, you're just beating inflation in Australia. Just beating inflation, and your returns are minimal. You really have no intentions to invest. Your money is better off going into your home loan and putting that off and getting a 3% return. So if you're renting, learn to invest. The other benefit of renting is obviously having the flexibility to move in, move out, go to a bigger home, a smaller home, no home at all, because it's much easier to move in and out of a lease than it is to move in and out of a mortgage. Trust me. I've done many of these. And obviously, you can have your own home and lease it out sometime in the future, which would save you stamp duty when you first buy it. But it just adds another layer of things you have to think about, and there are moving costs involved and all those other kind of things. So, I mean, it really depends on you and what your strategy is to grow wealth. I'll just leave it there. No personal advice. Now, obviously, one of the last benefits in renting is that you have no liability. And obviously, as a tenant, you have very little liability to the property. You don't have to pay for the rates. You don't have to pay for the water access. Sometimes you don't even have to pay for the water. If you're in a complex, well, this is Brisbane anyways, but if you're in a complex that isn't individually metered, then you don't have to pay for water consumption because it's metered as a whole. And if interest rates go up, down, sideways, backwards, forward, wherever it goes, that's something that the landlord has to worry about and not yourself. And if anything was to break structurally, or if there's a leak that happens, that's just the landlord that has to worry about that. And it's quite a pain in the butt. As a landlord myself, it's a pain in the butt because it really reduces down on your capital. But as also a tenant of the place that I'm staying in now, it's great. If anything goes wrong, then I just call out the landlord and let him know that, hey, by the way, you need to attend to this issue. Now, some of the cons of renting are obviously you don't have security. you have to answer to the landlord, and eventually at some point you're going to have to buy a home. And most people do, just because they want to have a family or they want to be stable in one spot and just have something they can call their own once they retire. Camera turned off on me. So what were we up to? That's right, the cons of renting. So obviously when you rent, there's no security behind that. And although, yes, a lot of us can say that the security is psychological, but just understand that the psychology affects your financial decisions and your decisions in real life, just as it affects your relationships and anything else within your life that happens. That's why we have therapists, that's why we have counselors, all these other kind of things. So I would not knock back or discount the importance of what security means to somebody psychologically and physically, because it means a lot to a lot of people and it can affect your well-being and how things go for you in the future. Because remember, as I was saying before, as a migrant to Australia, there's two things that I valued that made me feel, I guess, not poor as a kid, and that was having a roof over my head and the food on my table. So if we can account for one of those things and have one of those things as something that's for sure, then it means a lot to a lot of people out there. And one of the other things that we have to consider is that rent goes up in price over time. As the values of properties get higher and people want to live more in the city area where things are happening, rents slowly also go up unless, a lot more developments are approved and whatnot, and we get a lot more hotels and townhouses, then, that might go down or stabilize. Rarely ever goes down, stabilizes, but in most cases they do tend to go up. So in those cases, it's really beneficial to actually buy a home, because at least paying off the mortgage is something you can control. At least having the repayments smaller and shortened in the future is something you can control, as opposed to rent prices that will go up unless you want to, I guess, downsize and then move outwards from the city or outwards from area where people are living. Then that's when you could pay, I guess, a lesser price for rent. So that's it, guys. I'm giving you guys my thoughts on buying and renting. But I think to summarize things about those two topics, you really have to look at your lifestyle and what you want. If you have no intention to invest in the future, move anywhere, you know where your trajectory is, even if you want to take a vacation for 2 months, 4 months, I think the ideal position, remember, no personal advice on this, I think the ideal position is to actually buy your own home and pay it off. If you have no intention to invest, because at least you're saving 3 to 4% on interest that you would have to pay otherwise. If you want to invest and your rent is a lot less than what you would be paying in a home loan, and including all the rates and all the other costs that come associated with ownership, then obviously rent, move about, move overseas, do whatever you want, and then invest the rest of the money. And again, I can't stress how important it is that you actually invest the money and not just hold it for the sake of holding the money. You can also hold the money if you want to save up for a deposit for a home. That's fine, that works out as well, but don't just hold it for the sake of holding money and having it. And also put that money in an account where you can't touch it, because it's so easy if you're just renting and saving all of this money, and if you're bad with budgeting, to use all of that money and spend it. So that's it for me, guys. If you enjoyed the video, if it helped you out, if it was just a bit of entertainment, give me a like, subscribe to the channel. There'll be more videos coming up on this about finances, stocks, all those other kind of wonderful things. And I hope you have a good one. Cheers.